Okay, so we've got some really interesting material you shared. Articles, parts of books, all centering on Young Boys Inc., YBI out of Detroit, late 70s, 80s.
That's right.
And the plan today, really, is to dig into these sources and pull out the most important stuff, maybe some surprising things about them.
Absolutely. And when you start looking, it's clear YBI wasn't just your average street crew. Not at all.
Whoa, how so?
Well, the sources paint a picture of a really organized group, almost like a corporation in how they structured things, how they operated.
Right.
They were pioneers, really, among the first big African-American drug organizations operating right out on the street corners in the open.
Okay, so time frame, we're talking late 1970s kicking off.
Yeah, end of the 70s.
And the Dexter Davison neighborhood in Northwest Detroit was their home base.
That's the one. Ground zero. And the material prints to some, well, let's say innovative, but obviously illegal methods they use.
Okay, innovative. What's the first big thing that jumps out from the sources about their strategy, their modus operandi?
I think what's really notable and frankly quite chilling is how early they started using minors, kids, basically, as heroin couriers.
Using kids. Why?
Well, the sources are pretty clear on this. It was calculated. The legal system back then, juveniles just didn't face the same penalties as adults if they got caught.
Ah, a loophole.
Exactly. It was a way to insulate the leadership. The older guys, though they were often just late teens, maybe early 20s themselves, shield them from the heavy prison time.
Wow. That's, yeah, cynical is the word. But effective, I guess.
Highly effective, at least initially. It was a key part of their early rise.
So these kids at the front line taking the risks. Who are the masterminds? Who was actually running the show?
The sources named the original founders. Apparently they got together back in 1976. Right on the Bernie Elementary School playground, believe it or not.
A school playground,
Yeah.
seriously.
Yeah. Dwayne Davis, they called him Wonderful Wayne. Bernard Boykins, Bone Man. Reginald Chestnut, known as Nut. And Charles Lindsay, or Choicey Chuck. Then pretty soon after, Raymond Peoples, Baby Ray. He came in as a boss. And then a bit later, Butch Jones' big boy joined up once he was paroled.
So it grew from that core group on the playground. Quite a start.
It really is. A schoolyard start to, well, a major operation.
And the sources mention a big shift around 1978. Something pivotal happened then.
Yes, that seems to be a really key moment. Looking at how fast they grew, the sources suggest YBI actually split.
Split into different factions.
Exactly, into three main crews, one led by Davis, one by Peoples, and one by Jones, around 78.
Okay, so they decentralized. Did that help them?
It seems like it massively fueled their expansion. This structure, sort of separate but still under the YBI banner, let them just dominate Detroit's heroin scene.
Dominate how much?
The numbers in the sources are pretty wild. They suggest something like 80% control.
80% of the city's heroin traffic.
From summer 78 right through to about 87, yeah. And the estimated daily sales, just in Detroit, were apparently around $300,000.
$300,000 a day. That's staggering. Hard to picture that kind of money flowing daily.
It really puts the scale of their operation into perspective, doesn't it? And their impact on the city's, well, underground economy.
No kidding. And were they content with just Detroit? Or did they look further afield?
No, they definitely had bigger ambitions. Dwayne Davis, in particular, seems to have been the expansion driver.
Okay.
He made a very strategic move, sent one of his key lieutenants out to Boston.
Boston. Did it work?
Apparently, yeah. Big time. The sources say they pretty much took over the heroin market there, too, fairly quickly.
Huh.
At their peak in Boston, sales were hitting maybe $70,000 a day.
So not Detroit numbers, but still huge.
Absolutely huge. It really shows that sort of business-like approach to expansion, market penetration in another major city.
It's almost like they were franchising in a really twisted way.
You could almost see it like that, yeah. A dark franchise model.
But these kinds of empires, especially built on violence and drugs, they often eat themselves, don't they? Did internal problems start to emerge?
That's often the story, isn't it? And the sources definitely point that way for YBI. There was a huge event, a critical turning point, in September 1982.
What happened?
The alleged murder of Dwayne Davis, one of the original founders.
Murdered? By who?
The reports suggest it was Butch Jones. Apparently, it was over a turf dispute. Internal conflict boiling over.
Right, so one leader allegedly takes out another.
And that act of internal violence really seems to have started the unraveling process for them, at least in Detroit.
Okay, so Davis is gone. What were the immediate consequences? Did law enforcement step in?
Oh, absolutely. And fast. Just a few months later, December 1982, a massive indictment comes down.
Who got caught up in that?
Raymond Peoples, Butch Jones, the remaining top leaders, and get this, 41 of their main lieutenants.
41. Wow.
Yeah. Indicted, convicted, and they got hit with long, long prison sentences.
So, a major blow. What about Davis's crew, the ones who reported to him before he died?
Interestingly, the sources suggest his crew largely dodged that indictment wave. The thinking is, perhaps because Davis himself was already dead, the immediate pressure wasn't on them in the same way.
And what happened to Peoples and Jones long term?
Well, Jones got the long sentence. Peoples also went away, but he was actually released later in 1985.
Released.
Yeah, but tragically, he was assassinated not long after getting out. It just shows how the violence and conflicts carried on.
So the core Detroit leadership was basically wiped out pretty quickly between the murder and the indictments.
Effectively, yes, dismantled.
But did the name, the YBI organization itself, just vanish then? Or did it carry on somehow?
Well, this is where it gets interesting again. It shows the resilience, I guess, of the model they built. Remember Davis's lieutenant in Boston?
Yeah, the one who set up the operation there.
James Cooper, known as Pep. He basically just kept the YBI system going in Boston. He'd learned the methods, the structure, and he continued to dominate the heroin trade there for a while.
So the Boston branch survived the Detroit collapse.
For a time, yes. And then after Davis died, Pep actually came back to Detroit.
Back to Detroit to do what?
To try and pick up the pieces, essentially. The sources say he tried to revive YBI, kept it going in some form for about another 6 years.
6 more years, even after everything.
Yeah, they adapted. They kept operating until, really, the whole drug game changed dramatically with the arrival of crack cocaine. That shifted everything.
Right. Crack changed the landscape entirely.
But it does show how a successful criminal organizational structure can sometimes outlive its original founders.
So even with the original bosses gone, the YBI structure, the brand even, had momentum.
It definitely seems that way.
And what about their wider influence? Did YBI impact other groups beyond Detroit and Boston?
Oh, absolutely. The sources really emphasize this. YBI cast a long shadow nationally, especially through the 80s and into the 90s.
How so?
Well, later black drug cartels, particularly those coming out of Detroit, like Best Friends, Pony Down, even groups like the Black Mafia family and the Chambers brothers.
Yeah, I've heard of some of them.
The reports say they basically copied the YBI organizational playbook, their structure, their methods.
So YBI became a kind of template.
In many ways, yes. An influential, though obviously notorious template. Their fame, or infamy, got them a lot of media attention, too. Hundreds of articles, documentaries, even those 2 books you mentioned we looked at.
Right, the Butch Jones autobiography and the other one, Bound by Honor, Torn by Greed.
Exactly. And just to wrap up of those threads, the sources also mentioned Butch Jones eventually started cooperating with the feds after another indictment later on. And James Pip Cooper, the Boston guy who came back to Detroit, he also eventually died.
It's a complex story. Lots of violence, huge amounts of money, and significant consequences for a lot of people.
It really is. And it's a stark illustration, isn't it? These organizations, they can seem so powerful, make so much money, but they're built on such shaky, violent foundations,
Right.
Internal rivalries, law enforcement pressure. It's inherently unstable.
Okay, so let's try and tie this together. We saw YBI's really cynical but effective use of juveniles. That was key early on.
Definitely.
Then their incredibly rapid rise, dominating the heroin market in Detroit, expanding strategically to Boston, almost like a business expansion plan.
Right, that organizational aspect.
But then the inevitable downfall sparked by internal murder, followed by major law enforcement takedowns.
The classic pattern, in many ways.
Yet even in collapsing, they left this blueprint, this organizational model that other drug gangs ended up copying across the country. A lasting, if dark, legacy.
Precisely. A major force in their time and their methods, their story. It still resonates and gets studied today.
Yeah. Which kind of leaves us with a final thought, maybe something for our listeners to chew on. When you look at YBI's story, these strategies, the organizational structures, even though they came from this incredibly destructive, illegal enterprise, do they sometimes echo trends we see in legitimate business? Expansion, franchising, dealing with internal conflict. Obviously without the horrific violence and illegality.
Yeah.
But are there parallel dynamics?
It's a provocative question. How strategy and structure can emerge even in illicit contexts?
Yeah, it is. And of course, we absolutely have to remember the devastating human reality behind it all, the cost to individuals, to communities. It makes you wonder, too, about the social, the economic factors. What allows organizations like this to rise in the first place? And what pieces of that influence, that impact, are still felt today? Something complex to think about.
Definitely food for thought.
Well, thanks for breaking down this deep dive with us.
It's been a pleasure.